Hello, my name is Mike Earl, and this is the third video in my series on what I'm calling the outside first hypothesis. At the end of my previous video, I stated that the outside first hypothesis implies that all of us begin our journeys through life saddled with a categorically false belief about the world and about ourselves. And initially, we are completely unaware of this mistake. Now that's a fairly radical proposition. Let's see how we got to this point by quickly reviewing the arguments so far. Premise number one assumes that the outside first hypothesis is true, that all people will believe that what they see is located outside of their heads before they will believe it is located inside. Premise number two says that the outside and inside scenarios are mutually exclusive. Premise number three says that the outside scenario is wrong and the inside scenario is right. And premise four says that the outside scenario is initially experienced as a transparent assumption. Now, assuming these four premises are correct, we conclude that all people begin their lives with a categorically mistaken understanding of what they see, and initially they are completely unaware of this mistake. Next, we introduce a couple of very general definitions. We define the world as being the totality of all that exists. In other words, the world is everything. We define a human being as a subset of the world. Based upon these definitions, we then construct a diagram that illustrates the relationship between a human being and the world. I'll be referring to this diagram as the two-circle diagram. And yes, I know it's more like ovals, but hopefully you get the idea. As I mentioned last time, you can think of this diagram as a logical representation, like a Venn diagram, or a spatial representation. We now add another premise to our argument, which states that the two-circle diagram properly conveys the relationship between a human being and the world. Next, given our two-circle diagram and given our first four premises, we can now add two more premises. Premise number 6 says that the what I see is outside of my head scenario is equivalent to the what I see as the world scenario. In the context of our diagram, it looks something like this. Premise number 7 says that the what I see is inside my head scenario is equivalent to the what I see is me scenario. In the context of our diagram, it looks something like this. With these 7 premises in place, we're now in a position to draw our radical conclusion. Specifically, if I believe that what I see is located outside of my head, then I'm going to be mistaken about what I think the world is and what I think I am. I'll be mistaken about the world because I'll believe that what I see is the world when it's not. And I'll be mistaken about me because I'll believe that what I see is not me when it is. And according to our argument, this mistake is something all people make. It's a mistake that is categorically wrong, and it's a mistake that initially we experience as a transparent assumption. From this we conclude that all people begin life with a categorically mistaken understanding of the world and themselves. And initially, they are completely unaware of this mistake. So that's the argument up to this point. What I want to do next is introduce another diagram that basically conveys all the elements of our argument, but in a very compact way. I'm going to call this diagram the main exhibit, and it looks like this. Now, at first glance, the main exhibit probably looks fairly busy, but it's pretty easy to follow if we build the thing up one piece at a time. So let's do that real quick. We begin with a timeline because what we're really dealing with here is a great big before and after scenario. Now, the outside first hypothesis says that a person will believe that what he sees is located outside of his head before he'll believe it's located inside. And we're calling these two scenarios the outside scenario and the inside scenario. Now, the reason we believe the outside scenario first is because it agrees with the way things seem. The inside scenario, on the other hand, does not agree with the way things seem, and we believe it only after a rigorous examination of the relevant phenomena. The argument says that the outside and inside scenarios are mutually exclusive, and that's why they're separated here by a barrier of incompatibility. The argument also says that the outside scenario is wrong and the inside scenario is right. Our argument also equates the outside scenario with the belief that what we see is the world, and it equates the inside scenario with the belief that what we see is ourselves. To convey this idea, I've included the two circle diagrams I spoke of earlier. And like the outside and inside scenarios, the I see the world and the I see me scenarios are also incompatible. One more thing, and this is important. Early in the process, there is just one scenario, not two. So initially, there is no debating which scenario is right. There's just the transparent assumption that the way things seem is the way things are. And the way things seem is that outside scenario. Now, that we begin with such an assumption is going to play a very important role in our argument, as we will see. And that's the main exhibit. The main exhibit represents the intellectual trajectory of a person who goes from blindly assuming that what he sees is the actual world outside of his head to believing it's a two-dimensional retinal image inside his head. So the main exhibit represents a paradigm shift. This paradigm shift, I would contend, is something a person can experience only after exerting a focused effort. It requires effort because we're trying to break through an illusion that is at once deeply entrenched and utterly compelling. This effort involves two steps. First, the person must gain a basic understanding of the science of visual experience. He needs to understand that what he sees is the activity of his eyeballs and brain. In other words, he needs to be familiar with the scenario conveyed by an illustration like the one here. That's the first step. The second step is far more difficult. For now, the person must apply this understanding to his own experience. And by that I mean he must force himself, through an exercise of reason, to see through the illusion that he is looking out of his head and into the world itself. He must say to himself something like the following: if what the scientists tell me is correct, and I believe it is, then what I'm seeing right now, this cannot be the world, as I have always assumed it to be. What I'm actually seeing right now, for all intents and purposes, are the backs of my eyeballs, and I'm just now figuring this out. The moment the person experiences this realization, that's the paradigm shift. Now, a paradigm shift is not simply the acquisition of some new fact. It's a kind of conversion experience. It's at once the recognition of and correction of a mistake. And it requires rigorous and focused effort to overcome this mistake. It's not something that happens automatically. Now, that it doesn't happen automatically is very important. And to see why, let me share with you a brief clip that explores a quite similar realization that does happen automatically.
Who's that in the mirror?
This is known as a mirror self-recognition test, which may offer clues about the development of self-awareness. Without alerting the child, a mark is placed on its forehead.
Where's the baby? Where's the baby?
Usually, a baby younger than about 18 months doesn't make the connection between itself and the person in the mirror. The child may even look behind the mirror for the stranger it sees.
Hi. Hi.
But by about 18 months, there's a change in the child's awareness. Now it notices the red dot and the link between itself and the image in the mirror.
There are a couple of things from this clip that I'd like for you to notice. First, when a child comes to realize that what he sees is his own reflection, that realization happens automatically. It happens automatically and predictably at about the age of 18 months. The second thing to notice is that this realization involves the overcoming of a mistake. Prior to this realization, when a child looks into a mirror, he doesn't see a reflection of himself. What he sees is another child, and he sees that other child standing in a three-dimensional space that he just assumes to be an extension of the three-dimensional world that he himself is in. But this is wrong. It's a mirror. Interestingly, this mistake is something we share in common with many other animals. Like the children in the earlier clip, these animals don't see their reflections. What they see is another animal, and they see that other animal in the world. Sometimes the animal will literally hurl itself into the mirror thinking it's moving through more of the world. So just like the child, the animal is mistaking the two-dimensional surface of a mirror for the three-dimensional space behind the mirror. But unlike most animals, human beings emerge from this mistake, and we do so automatically. This particular mistake is relevant to our discussion because it's essentially the same kind of mistake addressed by our argument. In the case of the child in the mirror, we have an example of a human being mistaking the two-dimensional surface of a mirror for the three-dimensional world behind the mirror. In the case of our argument, we have a human being mistaking a two-dimensional retinal image inside of his head for the three-dimensional world outside of his head. Do you see the similarity? In both cases, we have a human being mistaking a two-dimensional surface for a three-dimensional space. And now a question. Human beings overcome the mirror mistake automatically by about the age of 18 months. At what age do human beings typically overcome the retinal image mistake? Do we even have numbers on this? Have psychologists ever thought to even ask this question? Perhaps the question we should be asking is not, when do people typically overcome this mistake, but rather, do people typically overcome this mistake? My suspicion is that a lot of people never overcome this mistake. Imagine stopping people on the street and asking them, "Excuse me, but can you tell me how old you were when you first came to realize that what you see is not the three-dimensional world outside of your head, but a two-dimensional retinal image inside your head?" I'm guessing that more than a few people would answer your question with a blank stare. I suspect a lot of people never overcome this mistake. They may understand the relevant science, but they've never rigorously applied that understanding to their own case, which a person needs to do before he can experience this paradigm shift. The takeaway point is this. The main exhibit does not represent the trajectory of all human beings. It only represents those who have experienced this paradigm shift. And I suspect that many people alive today have never had this experience. Furthermore, since this paradigm shift requires a certain amount of scientific awareness, it seems reasonable to suppose that the further we go back in time, we would find fewer and fewer people who would experience this paradigm shift. Because the further we go back in time, we would find less and less science. Which raises an interesting question. If we went back in time far enough, might we come to a time when no one had experienced this paradigm shift? A time in the past when everyone on the planet thinks that what they see is the world? I actually think there are good reasons to suspect this scenario is true. At the very least, I think it's worth exploring the possibility. With that in mind, I'd like to add another premise to our argument. Premise number 8. there was a time in the past before which the entire human population had yet to experience the backs of the eyeballs paradigm shift. In other words, there was a time in the past when the entire human population believes that what they see is the world itself. I'm justifying this premise by assuming that the further we go back in time, we'll find fewer and fewer people who have experienced this paradigm shift. And that's because the further we go back in time, we find less and less science. And science plays a causal role in the experience. But this is a two-way street. By the same logic, if we go forward in time, we should expect to find more and more people who have made the shift. Which raises another interesting question. Might there come a time in the future after which everyone in the world has experienced this paradigm shift? I think there are good reasons to think this scenario may be true. It's certainly worth considering the possibility. To that end, I would like to add yet another premise to our argument. Premise number 9. There will come a time in the future after which the entire human population will have experienced the backs of the eyeballs paradigm shift. If we assume that our argument up to this point is correct, we're presented with the following scenario. We have a time in the past where the entire human population believes that what they see is the world. And we have a time in the future where the entire human population believes that what they see is their eyeballs. So what we have here in effect are two epochs in the intellectual evolution of humanity, with each epoch characterized by one of these paradigms. Assuming this to be the case, we can now look at the main exhibit as representing not just the intellectual trajectory of some individuals, but the intellectual trajectory of the human species as a whole. Now, since we're describing a paradigm shift in which humanity is emerging from a false paradigm, you might think that our strategy going forward would be to rid ourselves of the false paradigm and replace it with the backs of my eyeballs paradigm. But that's not what we're going to do, and here's why. For many things we do, the old paradigm serves us perfectly well. I mean, you don't drive your car to the grocery store all the while reminding yourself that what you're seeing are the backs of your eyeballs. You'd probably run off the road. For many things we do, the old paradigm is not only more practical than the new, it's preferable. And I'm not just talking here about mundane things like driving to the store, but for really important things like morality and even some areas of physical science. So we're going to keep the old paradigm around, but with the understanding that it has limitations. We confront these limitations when we try to solve certain deep mysteries about reality, but we do so within the context of that old paradigm. Most notably, the mystery of our own conscious being, or trying to figure out how the world must ultimately be such that a subset of the thing is able to become our conscious being. To solve mysteries like these, we have to get completely out of that old paradigm, which is false, and squarely into the new. But to do that, we need to have really clear pictures of both paradigms. Another reason to have clear pictures of both paradigms is it will help us to gauge where we are as a species in this transition between these two epochs. And so with that in mind, the strategy going forward will be to articulate rigorous descriptions of both paradigms. And that's what we'll be doing in the next few videos. So that's it for today. Till next time, thank you for watching.